You think pastors live and die without mystery? Think again. Behind the pulpits, some of the church's most powerful voices fell under clouds of silence, shock, and speculation. One leader's long illness became a riddle. Another collapsed after years of secrecy, and a bishop's sudden weight loss set tongues wagging worldwide. Today, we count down the 10 pastors whose deaths didn't just make headlines, they shook the church to its core. Let's get into it. 10. We have James S. Tinney. He wasn't a flashy pastor with a private jet. He didn't roll up in million-dollar cars or drip in diamonds. James S. Tinney was different. He was a professor, a historian, a preacher, and for many, a voice of truth in the black church. But behind the respect, behind the classrooms at Howard University, behind the sermons, was a secret that would end in tragedy. Tinney did something in the early 1980s that most pastors wouldn't even dare whisper about. He started a church in Washington, D.C. called Faith Temple, and he made it clear everyone was welcome, including gay and lesbian believers. At a time when most pulpits thundered against homosexuality, Tinney opened his doors. It was bold, it was radical, and it put a target on his back. Critics said he was compromising the gospel. Supporters said he was finally telling the truth about God's love. Either way, Tinney wasn't backing down. He taught, he preached, he wrote. He became a pioneer of Pentecostal studies. But what no one knew was that his life was being slowly cut short. In 1988, at just 45 years old, James Tinney died. The official cause? AIDS complications. It was a diagnosis that most black churches at the time treated like a scarlet letter. Instead of mourning him as a brave pastor who broke barriers, whispers started. Some said it was God's judgment. Others quietly acknowledged the obvious. AIDS wasn't just out there. It was in the pews, in the choirs, and yes, even in the pulpit. Tinney's death sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. He had lived a double battle, one against a deadly disease and another against a church culture that wanted to erase him. He wasn't rich, he wasn't scandalous, but the way he died forced a question nobody wanted to ask. What happens when the very leaders preaching faith are hiding illnesses too shameful to admit? James Tinney didn't just die. His death exposed the silence, the stigma, and the secrets that still haunt the black church today. Number 9. The mysterious pastor. He was powerful, anointed, revered. In Benue State, Nigeria, this pastor was feared, not for scandals or misdeeds, but for the spiritual fire that burned through his sermons. He walked with an authority that silenced demons and moved crowds, but behind that commanding presence stood someone else, his secretary. Not his wife, not a deacon, the secretary. And this story was revealed not by one but two pastors.
You know where I serve now? Benue State, Macaulay. My pastor then was very anointed. We were afraid of his secretary, not his wife.
We knew the lady. She was the one that robbed young ministers of their future ministry. The giants, they lost their name in her corridor. So when we went there for a service, a church service, we now discovered that that girl was his secretary.
Whispers floated around her like smoke. Don't cross her, young ministers warned each other. Many entered her corridor and never returned the same. In fact, the giants, men once destined for greatness, lost their name, their calling, in that very hallway where she reigned. And yet no one dared speak openly. She was untouchable. Even the pastor's wife moved in shadows when she passed. Years later, the story took a turn no one expected. Pastor Yemi Davids, one of the pastors who revealed this information and who was once a young man serving under this pastor, had moved on. He had started a church in Lagos. He had survived. Until one day, she walked into his office. Gone was the confident, radiant woman who once wielded power with a glance. In her place stood someone unrecognizable, frail, trembling, a shadow of her former self. She looked like a broom. Before he could speak, she whispered words that made his blood freeze. "Pastor, it's HIV. Please, help me." He prayed. She died.
I prayed. She died. 3 years after, my pastor died of HIV himself. He's dead now.
3 years later, the pastor, her pastor, followed her to the grave. Same diagnosis, HIV. Same slow, silent shrink into death. The anointed vessel had been emptied by the very person he trusted most. The channel had been changed, the giants had fallen, and the man of God was gone. If you appreciate this kind of deep dive content, take a second to like the video and subscribe. Over 99% of viewers watch without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it helps us a ton. Thank you. Now, back to the countdown. 8. Carl Bean. Some pastors build megachurches, some build personal brands. Carl Bean built a movement. Long before inclusive churches became a buzzword, Bean stood on the front lines and declared that the gospel wasn't just for the straight, the powerful, or the socially acceptable. It was for everyone, including those cast aside during one of the deadliest health crises in history. Born in Baltimore in 1944, Bean grew up singing gospel music before turning to ministry. He would eventually found the Unity Fellowship Church movement in Los Angeles, a denomination often called the first church for Black LGBTQ Christians. While others preached exclusion, Bean preached inclusion. And when AIDS began tearing through communities in the 1980s, he didn't hide. He fought. He launched the Minority AIDS Project in 1985, one of the first organizations by people of color to directly respond to the epidemic. But here's the twist. While Bean fought publicly for others, his own health battles were shrouded in the same silence he worked so hard to break. When he died in September 2021 at the age of 77, reports only said he passed away after a lengthy illness. No one specified what the illness was. No one explained what really happened. And in that silence, the old whispers began again. Was it AIDS? Was it another condition? Was it simply age catching up with him? Nobody in the public sphere had the courage, or maybe the permission to say. The irony was sharp. A man who had given his life to battling the stigma around HIV/AIDS ended up leaving behind questions that sounded all too familiar. The same coded phrases, long illness, lengthy illness, that had followed the deaths of pastors decades earlier reappeared in the headlines. What makes Carl Bean's story different, though, is that he refused to let AIDS define him in life. His anthem, "I Was Born This Way."
I'm Archbishop Carl Bean, and my book is called I Was Born This Way. It's called I Was Born This Way, actually.
Became both a disco hit and a rallying cry for LGBTQ rights. His ministry redefined what the Black church could look like, and even in death, with the mystery surrounding his illness, he remains a symbol of resilience and defiance against the silence that crushed so many others. 7. T.B. Joshua. When it comes to African pastors, few names stirred as much devotion or controversy as Temitope Balogun Joshua, better known to millions as T.B. Joshua, founder of the synagogue Church of All Nations, SCOAN, in Lagos, Nigeria. Joshua wasn't just a pastor, he was a global brand. His church services were broadcast worldwide, his YouTube channel racked up millions of views, and his supposed miracles drew presidents, celebrities, and desperate believers from across the globe. To many, he was the prophet of our time. But in June 2021, at just 57 years old, Joshua suddenly collapsed and died. And in true T.B. Joshua fashion, the cause of death was never revealed. On paper, SCOAN said little more than that he met his creator after an evening service. No mention of heart failure, no mention of stroke, no mention death cause, just silence. For a man who had built his reputation on healing the sick and raising the dead, his own passing became one of the most mysterious deaths in African church history. The secrecy fueled rumors. Some whispered of chronic illness, others of COVID-19, and still others of AIDS, though nothing was confirmed. Investigations later alleged staged miracles and abuse inside his ministry, leaving his legacy split between prophet and showman. What makes Joshua's story even more dramatic is that it didn't end with his death. Investigations by outlets like BBC and Open Democracy had already raised serious concerns before he passed. Claims of staged miracles, manipulated footage.
I lost my sense of reality. I became T.B. Joshua's puppet. He pulled all the strings and I just danced to his tune. He was the architect.
And even abuse within his ministry. Former disciples alleged they were coached to fake healings for the cameras. Others described being threatened if they spoke out. In life, Joshua was larger than life. In death, he left behind a divided legacy. Was he a true prophet or the greatest religious showman Africa ever produced? What nobody can argue is this. Joshua's sudden, unexplained death proved once again that the pulpit is not immune to mystery, secrecy, or the illnesses it tries so hard to deny. 6. Philip Hunsu Ajose. The Celestial Church of Christ, or CCC, is one of the most influential African-initiated churches in the world. With millions of followers across Nigeria and beyond, its leaders are treated almost like kings, spiritual heads whose very words can move crowds. In March 2000, when Philip Hunsu Ayose was appointed pastor and spiritual head of the CCC, the faithful rejoiced. For many, he represented stability after years of leadership disputes. But less than a year later, joy turned into shock. Ayose had suddenly fallen ill, and by March 2001, he was dead. The church called it a tragedy. They announced his passing with solemn words, attributing it simply to illness. No details, no explanation, no medical record disclosed. And once again, the rumors began: spiritual attack, hidden disease, even whispers of AIDS. What makes his story even more striking is how quickly it all happened. He barely had a year to settle into the highest office of one of Africa's largest churches. He never got the chance to fully stamp his vision on the denomination. Instead, his brief leadership is remembered mostly for how abruptly it ended, and just like the deaths of so many other pastors, the narrative was wrapped up in euphemisms: brief illness, long illness, the will of God. Ahose's death highlights a pattern that runs deep. In the African church, when leaders die unexpectedly, the truth is often buried with them. Medical causes are replaced with spiritual language. Transparency is replaced with mystery, and the flock is left with rumors instead of facts. Philip Hunsu Ahose may not be a household name like TB Joshua, but his story adds another layer to this countdown. It shows that secrecy isn't just for megachurch prophets. It exists in traditional denominations too. And when the silence is this loud, people can't help but fill it with speculation.
Every life present in every situation be glory.
5. Taiwo Odukoya. If you lived in Nigeria, the name Pastor Taiwo Odukoya was impossible to ignore. As the founding pastor of the Fountain of Life Church in Lagos, Odukoya was a respected leader whose influence stretched far beyond the pulpit. His sermons were broadcast across television and radio, his books sold thousands, and his church was a powerhouse of Pentecostal Christianity. For decades, he preached faith, hope, and resilience. But in August 2023, his congregation was left stunned when news broke that their beloved pastor had died at the age of 67. And the strangest part? No one said why. The official statements were brief. His church announced his death with sorrow, but did not explain. No medical reports, no cause, just silence. For a man who had spent more than 30 years guiding thousands through life's storms, his own final chapter came wrapped in mystery. Speculation spread like wildfire. Some pointed to the heavy tragedies he had endured in recent years. His first wife, Bimbo Odukoya, one of Nigeria's most popular female preachers, had tragically died in a plane crash in 2005. In 2021, he lost his second wife, Namthi, after a battle with cancer. Just months before his own death, his twin sister also passed away. To many, it felt like sorrow had surrounded him, and whispers began. Did grief and stress wear him down? Was there an illness he kept hidden? Others suspected deeper secrets like AIDS. Social media exploded with theories, each one more dramatic than the last. Yet, just like with so many other pastors, the official line remained unchanged. The Lord has called him home. Euphemisms replaced facts, silence replaced clarity, and thousands were left with unanswered questions. Taiwo Odukoya's legacy remains powerful. He built one of Nigeria's most respected ministries, touched countless lives, and carried himself with grace even in tragedy. But his mysterious passing adds his name to a long list of pastors whose deaths left more questions than answers. 4. Reverend Steve Peters. Reverend Steve Peters wasn't a megachurch celebrity. He was the kind of minister whose life quietly cracked open the stories churches wanted to ignore. In 1985, he sat across from Tammy Faye on national TV and, in a moment that stunned viewers, spoke publicly as a gay Christian minister living with AIDS. An interview that forced millions to watch a reality many pulpits were still denying.
We have a young man named Steve Peters, and I'd like to introduce you to Steve. And we're going to be back in just a couple of minutes to talk to Steve. Steve is a patient of AIDS, and he so generously allowed us to talk to him today. And he was...
When I was finally diagnosed with AIDS, after this long period of feeling abandoned by God and by friends, I was diagnosed with AIDS in April of 1984 when they told me that I had two kinds of cancer, both terminal, Kaposi's sarcoma and lymphoma. And at that time, I fell apart, and I absolutely lost my...
After that on-camera confession, Peters became both a lightning rod and a lifeline. He spent decades editing AIDS newsletters, working with faith-based AIDS ministries, and pressing religious communities to answer suffering with care instead of condemnation. His ministry was courtroom and counseling room, press release and pastoral letter, a life spent turning private shame into public witness. Peters also rewrote expectations. Doctors once gave him months. He survived through experimental treatments and became one of the longest-living, visible people living with HIV in America, someone the epidemic could not erase. That survival made him a living rebuttal to the panic and silence of the 1980s, a reminder that the disease cut across closets, choirs, and pulpits alike. When he died on July 8, 2023, after a hospitalization for an infection and a battle with metastatic gastrointestinal cancer, the headlines read like a eulogy and a history lesson at once. Here was a man who had forced a nation to look, and whose death reawakened old questions about faith, secrecy, and care. Some commentators remembered the 1985 interview as a cultural turning point. Others used his passing to ask, again, what the church had learned or refused to learn from the crisis. In this countdown of pastors whose deaths expose the hush around illness and power, Peters's story lands differently. Not a mystery to whisper about, but a public life that dared to name the disease, name the stigma, and demand compassion, and then lived long enough to change how people remembered both the epidemic and the pulpit. 3. Bolaji, Big Bolaji Olarawaju. In Nigeria's gospel music scene, the name Big Bolaji carried weight. Not only was he a dynamic gospel singer, but he was also a pastor in the Redeemed Christian Church of God, RCCG, one of the largest Pentecostal churches in the world. Known for his booming voice, high-energy praise sessions, and infectious charisma, Bolaji wasn't just another pastor. He was a movement all by himself. Wherever he went, crowds gathered. His songs weren't just sung, they were shouted, danced to, and lived by millions. That's why his sudden death in April 2025 sent shockwaves across Nigeria's Christian community. Official reports stated simply that he died after a brief illness. No further explanation, no details about what really happened, just another tragic headline that left thousands of fans and church members in disbelief. On social media, tributes poured in. Fans remembered his unforgettable stage presence. Fellow gospel artists shared stories of how he lifted spirits both on and off the pulpit. RCCG members called him a soldier of Christ who gave his all until his last breath. But beneath the flood of emotion was a familiar pattern, no clarity. Once again, the phrase "brief illness" replaced real answers. The whispers began. Was it a hidden disease? Was it exhaustion from years of non-stop ministry? Some even speculated on spiritual warfare, but officially, nothing more was ever said. His family and church chose silence, leaving his followers with grief but no closure. What makes Big Bolaji's story especially dramatic is the contrast between life and death. On stage, he was pure fire, shouting, singing, commanding audiences with joy. In death, he became another case of a pastor whose story ended in shadows. For many, it was a painful reminder that no matter how loud the praise, illness and mystery can still silence the strongest voices. Bolaji, Big Bolaji Olarawaju left behind more than music. He left a legacy of worship and energy that touched countless lives. But he also left behind a question mark, a reminder of how the church continues to cloak sickness and death in secrecy. 2. Sam Obi. Most pastors are known only within their churches, but Pastor Sam Obi was different. He straddled two worlds, the pulpit and politics. As the general overseer of the Oracle of God Ministry International in Asaba, Delta State, Nigeria, Obi wasn't just preaching to hundreds, he was also shaping policy. In 2010, he briefly served as the acting governor of Delta State, making him one of the rare pastors whose influence reached both the spiritual and political spheres. But in April 2021, news broke that Sam Obi had died after a brief illness. Just like that, the pastor-politician was gone, and once again, nobody knew why. The announcement was terse. No medical records, no explanations, no details, just a brief illness. It was the same vague phrase that seems to haunt the deaths of African pastors. For a man with such a public profile, the lack of clarity only fueled speculation. How could someone so prominent, so visible, suddenly disappear with no real cause offered? In his community, Obi had been celebrated for his passion and dedication. He had balanced ministry with politics, building a reputation as a servant leader. Tributes poured in after his passing. Members of his church praised his humility and compassion. Political colleagues remembered his integrity during his short stint as acting governor. But even as praise filled the air, questions lingered. What was this brief illness? Was it something that had been hidden for years? Was it sudden? Or was it another case where the truth was considered too damaging, too taboo to say out loud? In a society where illness, especially HIV, AIDS, and other stigmatized conditions, has often been hidden behind euphemisms, Obi's death fit an all-too-familiar script. The drama of Obi's story lies not in scandal or exposure, but in contrast. In life, he lived in the public eye, balancing pulpits and politics with boldness. In death, his story was reduced to a single line, stripped of transparency. His followers were left with grief, and the public was left with a mystery. Sam Obi's legacy is complex: a pastor who dared to step into politics, a politician who never left the pulpit, and a leader whose final chapter was cloaked in silence. His name now sits alongside others on this list as proof that even the most powerful voices in the Black church can be muted, not just by death, but by secrecy. 1. Bishop Eddie Long. For years, Bishop Eddie Long ruled Atlanta's church scene like a king. As senior pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, he grew a small congregation into a 25,000-member megachurch. He wore sharp suits, drove luxury cars, and preached prosperity to crowds that saw him as larger than life. But behind the pulpit, his story unraveled into scandal, secrecy, and tragedy. In 2010, Long's empire cracked when 4 young men accused him of misconduct.
I get the sound of his voice out of my head, and I cannot forget the smell of his cologne, and I cannot forget the way that he made me cry many nights when
They said he used his authority to lure them into relationships while showering them with trips, gifts, and cars. The bombshell was devastating, especially since Long was famous for denouncing homo. He denied it all, standing before his church with a Bible in hand. But instead of fighting the allegations in court, he settled privately, reportedly paying millions. The silence spoke louder than any sermon. Then came his health decline. In 2016, Long reappeared in public looking shockingly frail. Once broad-shouldered, he was now thin and gaunt, sparking a storm of rumors. Some said cancer, others whispered AIDS. His church fueled speculation by calling it only a health challenge. Long himself dismissed the chatter, claiming a raw vegan diet explained his weight loss. But the images told another story. By January 2017, Eddie Long was gone. The official cause was listed as an aggressive form of cancer, but many didn't buy it. His sudden decline, the secrecy around his illness, and his past scandals made the whispers impossible to silence. Was it really cancer, or was the truth too damaging for the church to admit? What makes Eddie Long the most shocking name on this list isn't just how he died, but how he lived. A man who preached purity while facing accusations of exploitation, who promised prosperity but left behind scandal. In life, he was untouchable. In death, he became the ultimate reminder that even the biggest pastors can fall. Now that you know how these pastors passed on, what if I tell you that there is another set of pastors that might end up like these ones? See the truth for yourself by watching our video on Exposed: Rich Black Pastors Who Lied About God for Power.